garden. It gives me great pleasure to introduce John. John is reader in English education at the University of East Anglia in the UK. His research focuses on oral narration, literature, and the relationship between interaction, learning, and pedagogy. And then these are intersection of these subjects are really interesting for us as well in SALT research environment. And then there's a good reason that we have John with us today, and then he kindly accepted our invitation. John is a teacher and also a very experienced teacher educator, and his recent book published by Routledge has recently come out. Maybe John can send us a link also at the end of his talk for those who are interested. The title of the book is Researching Interpretive Talk Around Literary Narrative Texts, Shared Novel Reading. Well, the floor is yours, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Soljay, and thank you for inviting me to join this group today. Personally, I feel very privileged to be able to join this group, and I look forward later in the afternoon to hearing colleagues' responses to the details that I'll talk through this afternoon. And I hope everyone's safe and well too. Obviously very much aware of circumstances for everyone across the world, and yeah, hope things are fine for everyone. If I just begin now, I'll just share my screen and the slides, and hopefully, Oljay, if you wouldn't mind just confirming that those are visible for everyone.
I can see the slides. It's not on full screen mode yet.
No, it should be, shouldn't it?
Yes, that should work.
As long as the slides are big enough, I'm happy for people to see the details at the side as well. Is that clear, Oljay, for everyone?
It is clear, but does that button which says start from the first slide work when you click on file? Yeah, from beginning.
Yeah, it seems not to be changing. I don't quite know
I
why.
think maybe your presentation is already open, although you're not sharing it. That's why.
That would be right. Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. So if I do this again, thank you. Let's try that again. Okay, I think we're nearly there. Let's have a look. Nearly there. Okay. Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I don't know what was different there, but glad to see that that's ready there. Okay, so yes, thank you for introducing the presentation, Oljay, and as everyone will see from the slide there, what I'd like to do today is talk through some research which focuses on the role, if you like, the place of literature in classroom dialogue, and particularly focused on the words on the page and how they enter the speech of teachers and students. And as I talk through that as well, just to explore a little bit more fully the background research that led to me looking closely at some transcripts of classroom dialogue and developing a way of approaching those transcripts in, I suppose, for research purposes. Just before I move into that detail, if I give some context as well, which I think are relevant to how I chose to frame the research really as well. So I work, you'll see on the map there on the left of the screen, in the UK in Norwich. It's in the east of England, and I work at the University of East Anglia. And the university, we call it the UEA, is based in Norwich, which happens to be a UNESCO City of Literature and the first city in the UK to be designated that status. And then also within the department where I work, we host the UNESCO Chair for Adult Literacy and Learning for Social Transformation. My department is the School of Education and Lifelong Learning, and I think just that context is maybe quite important, because I conducted the research around Norwich and the local area, and you can see that investment and interest in the study of literature is certainly strong in our area. And towards the right of the screen, just a little bit of detail there about Norwich as well, and also at our university we had the first creative writing master's level course in Britain as well, and that has alumni such as Ian McEwan, Katsuo Ishiguro as well. So I think that's important, because I did move as part of the research into working with the local community as well, and the research I describe, although the focus I'll talk about today relates to schools, I did look at reading in the wider community a little bit as well. So broadly, I'm going to focus today on the role of texts in literary studies, and particularly what's often interested me in practice and research is how teachers of literature present texts, and I'm obviously interested in all forms, but this research concentrates on novels and prose narratives. And again, actually, it's probably relevant to say that in my time at UEA, I've worked at the university for nearly 20 years. Much of that time I've spent working in initial teacher education, and being the course leader for the programme that prepares new teachers to teach English and literature in secondary schools. And so I often saw it as part of that role, and following my experience before that as a teacher myself in secondary schools, I obviously felt it was important in both roles to understand and to work to improve teaching of novels, but to understand that as well. So it strikes me as a very subtle, important skill of teachers of literature to present literature well and to guide their students in that reading. So just towards the bottom of the slide, you will see that through this presentation I'll outline the research methods developed in this work, which relate to conversation analysis and focus on classroom interaction and teacher exposition, teacher talk. I'll share some classroom data, and towards the end of the presentation talk about some application of this research and related transcripts in university-based teacher training here in the UK. Before that, I'll give a little bit of a context, I suppose, the background research as well that led me to this, because I didn't start this research with an intention necessarily to focus on how texts entered conversation in the classroom. It was just something that emerged through the process. But eventually, and you'll see here in the middle of the screen, I came towards a focus on how teachers shape a dual experience for students. when they shape and organise and manage their students' encounters with novels in the classroom. And within literary study, that's partly about helping students enjoy literature, but also developing them as critics. And the researcher Louise Rosenblatt has used the term embryonic critics, which I found very appealing as one of the, I suppose, a very clear way of describing what teachers are trying to achieve for their students. So the background study involved a survey of members of the public around Norwich and some online surveys as well nationally, exploring with members of the public what novels they read at school and why, most importantly, why they remembered them and why those experiences were powerful for them. And through that, I wanted to understand what made for effective teaching. And by effective teaching, I had in mind not just equipping students to be successful in examination, but to support reading habits beyond school and across their lives. And at the same time, I conducted some interviews with teachers and observations in schools, recorded observations from which these transcripts that I'll show derive around the practices teachers use in the classroom, how that works, and to what effect. So that's a general background. I suppose the practice I had in mind, and I'm quite conscious that this may not work in quite the same way in every area and every curriculum across the world, but an activity of at its simplest, teachers reading a novel to a class, and sometimes framing that with comment and inviting children or young people to comment on the text, and it applies in higher education as well. And my research has covered higher education interaction also. So that's the general activity that I'm interested in. If I just summarise that through a literary example, actually, this is from a John Steinbeck collection of stories about life in a Californian valley, which goes by the name of the Pastures of Heaven. And there was a description in this book of a teacher arriving at a school, a young teacher who's described by Steinbeck as having a breathless enthusiasm for her trade and the impact her reading to classes has on pupils. And so Steinbeck writes, the pupils received Miss Morgan's innovations with enthusiasm. Classes became exciting, and even the boys who had made enviable reputations through teacher baiting grew less interested in the possible burning of the schoolhouse. Miss Morgan introduced a practice that made the pupils adore her. Every afternoon she read to them for half an hour. She read by instalments, Ivanhoe and The Talisman, fishing stories by Zane Grey, hunting stories of James Oliver Curwood, The Seawolf, The Call of the Wild, not baby stories about the little red hen and the fox and the geese, but exciting grown-up stories. Miss Morgan read well. Even the tougher boys were won over until they never played hooky for fear of missing an instalment, until they leaned forward, gasping with interest. And it seemed to me that that's the sort of impact that maybe most, or possibly all, teachers would hope for when they read and share texts with classes. There's that full engagement and enjoyment of what's being read, but of course often that's coupled with what I termed developing students as embryonic critics. So I've moved towards trying to describe that process, and I decided to call it pedagogic literary narration, and hopefully that will become clear why as I speak as well. A way to describe that very particular activity of teachers of literature when they present narrative texts, but also use talk around those texts as well, which is to assist students' development as embryonic critics. So it's not just reading, but about framing and guiding students' responses and supporting that with scaffolds. I use the term just reading there as well, in that the teachers that I worked with showed great modesty and humility. And when I joined them in classes, one or two of them said, "You may not be interested in the lessons today, we're just reading in class." But it seemed to me that modest description belied the skill and the craft that they exhibited in their work presenting texts. So my researchers tried to develop an analytic method derived from conversation analysis. It's based on empirical data to explore the nature of those interactions and particularly to account for the role of texts in interaction. And so stepping outside of that jargon, it's really about the interplay of different voices. And those might be the real voices of people in the classroom, the teacher, the students, but also textual voices, the narrator's voice, and the other voices that are represented or reported, sometimes directly, sometimes by paraphrase within prose fiction. And so the place of quotation became a key interest for me in this research. If I just go back to the survey, I was struck by, when this approach to reading works well, how powerful it is. And this was a gentleman speaking some decades after his time at school, but remembering his school experience very fondly, what he describes as a warm glow. And it was Mark Twain's Adventures of Tom Sawyer that he recollected particularly. But my research also showed the surveys that of course it's not always so positive, the experience, and again there's another fictional example which describes literary study in higher education, Christopher Isherwood's A Single Man, where the protagonist George finds that some frustrations in the response of his classes, and you can see the summary there, and an extract from the novel. At first, as always, there's blank silence. The class sits staring, as it were, at the semantically prodigious word about. What is it about? Well, what does George want them to say it's about? And you get this sense that sometimes this literary study is no more than a game. They'll say it's about anything he likes, anything at all. For nearly all of them, despite their academic training, deep down, still regard this about business as a tiresomely sophisticated game. And again, that came through in the surveys as well. That sometimes it wasn't always a positive experience for students. And if I just step forward through a few slides, you can see that less positive experience represented in this quotation. It was a set book for GCE for examination. It's put me off Thomas Hardy or the novels of Thomas Hardy ever since. And also a remark there that it didn't seem to relate to students' interests at that moment in their lives, whether male or female. So positive and negative experiences. And then broadly, the survey, I think, suggested that, yeah, done well, that sort of reading activity can be transformative. Done less well can inhibit reading pleasure. It suggested a correlation between the teacher reading aloud parts of novels to their classes and how students enjoyed that. A little bit more complex where students were invited to read aloud and frustrations, both from students who were listening. They sometimes found that difficult. Maybe the fluency of the narration was disrupted a little bit if students weren't confident readers. And of course, when they were reading aloud themselves, so that it would distract from their attention to the narrative. More broadly as well, the novels that were recollected suggested teachability in the sense of novels that were highly episodic, often organised according to chapters that would fit neatly within hour-long teaching sessions, or a typical duration of a lesson. But perhaps most relevant today is the value of narrative for its own sake in that process. So it's clear shared reading had lasting impact, sometimes good, sometimes for ill. It could actually put people off reading and undermine their interest in reading across their lives. before commenting any further, I now have a short film to show you as well, where you'll see some of those views elaborated, and should be ready to play that straight away. I think the settings here will allow you to hear, but again, please do let me know if that's not the case.
To at school was a joy, you know, Friday afternoon or something, if people would read to you.
The books I read at school, classics like Jane Austen or Dickens, I still go back to because I enjoyed reading them. Even though we didn't read aloud in school, I read alone, and that was,
John, I'm very sorry,
it was always a good
interrupt
homework
you,
if I just
we can't see the video.
Oh, you can't? Right, okay.
No,
That's
so
strange.
and it
Okay.
seems very interesting. We hear it perfectly.
Ah,
We can't
okay.
see it, so I think
Right.
It might be open in
in
the other
another
monitor,
screen
yeah.
possibly. So
Right.
you need to minimize your PowerPoint.
Yes, I'll just
Make sure you share your screen
start a new share.
and keep the sound settings because they were perfect.
Great. Okay. Can you see that now, Elizabeth?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, I'll take that from the start again for everyone.
To at school was a joy, you know, Friday afternoon or something, if people would read to you.
The books I read at school, classics like Jane Austen or Dickens, I still go back to because I enjoyed reading them. Even though we didn't read aloud in school, I read alone, and that was, it was always a good homework if I just had to read a few chapters of a book. I'm still completely and utterly in love with Jane Austen. I still know most of the books word for word.
It was a real treat, and to sit back and listen and to imagine all that and to be there together in this. And I think it was important to form a sort of spirit as a class, that we came together as a class.
We would also read an hour in class, and then at the end, last 15 minutes or something, we would discuss like what we interpreted out of it, what was significant in the language that was used, or specific character developments and things that we admired within the plot.
To be honest, when we had to read out loud, I was really nervous, and I thought more about that than the actual novel itself. So I guess it was kind of a negative experience because it didn't really allow me to enjoy the novel itself.
I love to read it aloud in front of the class, but I know that for others it was rather a bit of a nightmare.
Some people just won't do it or just won't be interested, but if you start from a young age to read stories to people out loud, then they will enjoy getting the story read to them, so they will want to read more of the story or just continue reading on their own.
I taught at the International School of Bern, and we did a classic children's book, not Heidi, which I still haven't read as a Swiss person who is even connected to, I think, Johanna Spiri is somehow around seven corners even related, or I'm related to her as an ancestor. But I still haven't read that one.
Holes, where they get sent to a juvenile torture camp, have to dig holes, and then they discover the history of the place.
Well, with Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Flies, I think it was, 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 it was perhaps something I would not have, or I certainly hadn't read, or perhaps would not have read otherwise. So it was quite a good choice, I say, and I think because it's about teenagers, so kind of like people your own age or perhaps slightly older. So it was actually quite different from the things I had read before, I think.
Buddy, which I can't really remember much about, apart from that the characters were quite flat.
Of Mice and Men, I remember crying at the end of the book, like with the rest of my class. It was so sad, it was so unexpected. And then I remember watching the film and like, it was silent. Everyone was so affected by this film. And that was really nice because we were able to like read it together, understand the characters more together, and I know it was interesting to see how characters develop.
And I also remember having to read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe when I was on Prince Caspian, which was quite frustrating.
It taught me to read more into things rather than just read what's on the page.
I think perhaps because you talk about it with your mates, don't you? I mean, you have to write essays and do those criticisms and things like that. But you actually start talking about it, which certainly amongst like your peer group, if you read something at home, that doesn't necessarily happen. So it's kind of like there was a communal quality about it.
Yeah, initially I'd counter and argue my socks off, but a little while later I go, yeah, maybe you have your mind changed. It's almost like education.
Reading in class, again, we're focusing on one particular thing. What's important is their discussion, their invitation of understanding from their, without saying education is a drawing out as much as a putting in, that's obviously so important. It's asking the people that you're working with what they feel about it, but the English teacher is absolutely crucial, key.
Okay, so hopefully that was visible to everyone and clear, and I felt personally that some of the speakers there speak very eloquently about their experience of reading in school, and the voices represented there actually describing experiences in France, Switzerland, the States, Argentina, so not just representing the experience in the UK, indicating maybe that activity is commonly experienced in school. If I now just resume the slideshow and just give you a little bit of detail very quickly about that wider survey. So the respondents represented schooling in most across most of the second half of the 20th century, 1940s onwards. The majority described their experience in school of reading as very positive, but a few enjoyed it less. And certainly referring in the wider survey to experiences of studying in the UK, these were the most mentioned novels, which partly reflects the nature of the curriculum, particularly for England and Wales. Other parts of the UK have some slightly different curricular arrangements and sometimes different texts. So if you know any of those texts, of course, some of them, as I say, are highly episodic and perhaps interesting as well, that there's very little, if anything, there. There were maybe in the wider lists there were examples of novels written in the last 10 or 20 years, but each novel there is clearly older than that as well. If I just move through these quotations from respondents as well about the importance of characterization in this example, but again, a bit like a speaker in the film, the second sentence there, I was able to access a text that I may not have been able to fully appreciate if I'd attempted it by myself, suggested to me that, the importance of the teacher in shaping that reading experience. And this quotation is perhaps my favourite of all. On reading, I felt like a starving man confronted with a banquet. Those English literature classes were the most memorable experiences of my education. And if I move forward quite briskly to some quotations now from interviews with students. So these were students aged 14 to 15 at the time of the research. They convey sometimes not feeling that the activity is particularly productive, and certainly not comfortable. But they also make perceptive comments about the, if you like, again, the dual purpose of reading in school, so preparation for the exam, and here you could see in the larger quote highlighted in black, the frustration perhaps that they're not looking at texts that have what this student calls a really good storyline. And this problem is elaborated here. I think the books are largely chosen on like the techniques they have in them and what they want us to learn, like Dr. Jekyll and Hyde. It's a lot about analysing key quotes and themes and stuff. And again, that became relevant to my research interest. And further on, just move through those slides a little bit. Just in the comments here, I think the student, again, particularly highlighted in black again, the student talks about what the student recognises as the value of reading together, that it supports, if you like, cognition and their emotional response to the novel. So there's a sort of tension between what the other student described as looking at techniques, but also this immersion into the conventions of literary study. So certainly wasn't suggested that was a problematic or difficult thing for everyone. But those issues were relevant as I moved towards the research and transcript data. So just returning to my introductory slide, I'll move now onto the research methods, which began to focus on that narrative dimension. So in that form of classroom teaching, the teacher has to present the text. Often it may be the student's first experience of that story. So one function of that reading is to introduce them to the story, but often simultaneously it involves developing the embryonic critic, an induction to literary criticism, and often the very specific requirements of analysis that specific text demands. And I began to look at this relative to what Paul Seedhouse calls a three-way view of learning in classrooms, and you see that in the middle of the slide there towards the top, and these are the three broad views. Now, in the wider research, I would say that this relates to narratology as well. So I'm interested in how teachers frame prose narratives, which often, or certainly again in the UK context, might draw on what might be called classical narratologies, focused on the structure of texts, characters and themes, as the students had mentioned. But obviously in this research, we'll look at that maybe from a more post-classical perspective about the narrative work teachers engage with as they introduce texts to speech. And then more broadly in the study, I looked at informal book group talk as well, and what I called vernacular narratologies. I found similar things happening, but perhaps without the jargon of literary study in informal reading groups. Now, if I can just come back to the Paul Seedhouse details. On the left there, you see Paul, my sort of paraphrasing of the Seedhouse views of language and interaction, and he had a focus on second language learning, L2 learning. And so to be included in that category for analysis, the interaction would involve language as the object of study. The approach to teaching, the pedagogy, has a reflexive relationship with interaction, and the teacher is interested in evaluating the linguistic forms and interactions between learners in his or her classroom. I chose to adapt that for literary study to account for the focal key role of literary texts. So in literary study, the text becomes the object of instruction, although language is a dimension of interest as well, of course, embodied in the text. I suppose also the text as an aesthetic artifact. Similarly, there's a reflexive relationship between pedagogy and interaction, but again, the text enters into that relationship as well. And then finally, yes, linguistic forms and patterns are of interest to the teacher of literature, but they're patterns that again relate to the study texts, and often, of course, by managing and guiding those interactions, the teacher is seeking some insight into how students read and how they respond to what they read. So that's if you like, the disciplinary or institutional context in the term Seedhouse uses. And then the second view is just down in the bottom of the slide there, you'll see a focus on pedagogic literary narration, this shared reading activity, and view 3 demonstrated in transcript data, the micro level of those exchanges, those conversations. It's probably important as well to acknowledge a concept of reader in this research as well. So I've mentioned Louise Rosenblatt, and would add to what I've said about embryonic critics, the terms that Rosenblatt uses distinguishing between aesthetic reading, recognizing the artistic qualities of texts and responding affectively to those, and what she calls efferent reading, of carrying away information. And that's the distinction between burning through a sort of emotive experience that grips the learner in the same way that Miss Morgan seemed to manage in her reading to the class in Passages of Heaven, and the more, if you like, functional but equally essential aspects of carrying away information, maybe that a student can use in answering an exam question on the novel. Also related to that, from the teaching perspective, a term that Douglas Barnes used in research in English classrooms again, differentiated attentiveness. So in teaching, any teacher may guide the attention of their students in different ways. It might be through gesture, it might be through intonation, but one way or another they are skillfully directing students' attentiveness. And again, I began to feel that teachers of literature do this all the time, often at a level that's quite intuitive, or appears intuitive and spontaneous, and not necessarily at the level of planning lessons, but it's part of the in the moment expertise of teachers. And that entails when the text enters speech, emphasis of tone, using emphasis and tone to bring out what's described here as the structures and implications of the text, to foreground details for students' attention, make them alert to salient details in the text. And I think that relates also to the novel form as well, that novel describes human life in different ways and from different perspectives. So somehow it seems suited to the pedagogy of novels that you enliven that and embody that in the classroom, and realize the world of the novel as fully as possible in the classroom. And often that is through voice. Now, I've mentioned the narrative dimension as well, and so my approach to describing this sort of literary interaction, recognised the structural narratologies I've mentioned, and again in UK classrooms, even at primary level, sometimes that might be referred to as the story mountain, moving from the initial situation, an action, climax, different terminology used in different models, but I don't think really in the discourse, in discussions around teaching literature in the UK, there's been much attention to the narrative work teachers engage in. So my term, pedagogic literary narration, it was intended to recognise some of these elements that teachers obviously begin to draw out the text in speech, and mediate the text, and often that's through spoken quotation. And in the terms Douglas Barnes used, that differentiates students' attentiveness. The use of spoken quotations begins to achieve that. And even in single moments, turns of speech, teachers combine narrative, analytic comment, and specialist terminology. And it's that sort of talk that I analyse in the transcripts here. That term pedagogic literary narration, you can see a link there at the bottom of the screen, is described in an open access article at that link as well. So if I move to the classroom data and share some transcripts, these now relate to a secondary school lesson based on this novel, The Ghost of Thomas Kemp. At the very simplest, the first transcript I show will demonstrate how the words of the text are embedded in the teacher's speech. So here the teacher begins, this is early in the lesson. I'm going to read a little bit more to you, and I want you to be thinking about whether there's anything that comes up about language, interests, or attitudes when I read this next paragraph. We got halfway down the page, at page 6 last lesson, and I'm just going to read a little bit more. And then the teacher begins to read. They were almost home now. James could see the window of his attic room, staring over towards the church. The cottage was small, square, and comfortable. Coming to live in it had been like putting on an old coat. It had a sagging slate roof, a bulge at one end where once there had been a bread oven, huge beams, creaking stairs, and stone floors with interesting cracks from which emerged at night large and stately black beetles. And of course it continues. And then the teacher rounds off that turn with further comment, responding to perhaps a movement or a gesture of a student. I think that's Mrs. Harrison, Helen. Already in that paragraph, I think we've got something that we could answer. And then again, she invites a student comment. So the teacher there demonstrating at its simplest, if you like, the turn of the page. It's entering the teacher's talk. And then in the rest of this research, I was interested in how that influenced subsequent turns. From that extract of text that the teacher selected to read, you can see in this current slide, in the highlighted item, the teacher is beginning to organise student reactions to the text as well. So one student has suggested in turn 6 that the narrator's language is formal, or the protagonist, sorry, the language of the protagonist is formal. And then the student C in the next turn actually argues, well, actually, the protagonist didn't speak. And so you begin to have this interesting exchange around narrative voice, about whose voice is it, or how voices are embedded, if you like, in the voice of the narrator. And it's that relationship between voices, if I move through now, that I was interested in the application of conversation analysis as well. And if I show you some transcript material now which does that in far more detail, this relates to teaching around the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the transcripts that are in the article that Olje circulated for everyone. And again, at its simplest, the extract on the right, this is a teacher talking about the novel combines this re-narration and analysis concurrently. So you have the narrative in blue and the framing and analysis in brown. So this is what the teacher says. So as we come into that paragraph on pathetic fallacy, we already appreciate how the characters are feeling. They're going to Jekyll's house now to find out what on earth is going on. We don't know as a character, we don't know what's happening, okay, but we do know that Jekyll's been locking himself up again, and we know that Poole is very, very afraid. So that really interested me. As I say, this wasn't the sort of thing I set out to research specifically, but that interplay and that economy in the teacher's talk began to really intrigue me and led me to begin to analyse talk in the lesson, both of the teacher and through interactions, applying conversation analysis. And again, this teacher comment, if I read just a little bit of this, obviously the conversation analysis allows you to mark out pauses, shifts in intonation and volume. Okay, he's doggedly disregarded a question. He is deliberately avoiding answering the question. It builds up the suspense, you know, the theme of mystery. Okay, so as we come into that paragraph on pathetic fallacy, we already appreciate how the characters are feeling. And I'll pause there with the reading, but I think that's probably enough just to demonstrate how emphatic that teacher was at points in the reading, and how on occasion words such as suspense and mystery are being highlighted. So there's seems to me a relationship between what's overt, if you like, what's overtly stated, if you like, the propositional content of that turn, and the more tacit guidance and framing of students' attentiveness through intonation, emphasis, even by pauses as well. And I began then to be interested how spoken quotation entered into that sort of teacher turn. And again, that arose from the wider data set. So if I return to this slide about pedagogic literary narration, and you'll see the third item there, that the teacher embedded spoken quotation from the text. In my data for the lessons around Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, at secondary school teaching with students aged 15 and 16, when I analysed 6 lessons, the transcripts from 6 lessons, I found that a third of all teacher turns, 1 in 3, embedded direct quotation from the study text. And that seemed to me significant and something that would be unlikely in any other discipline, and something that was maybe important to understand and explain. How does spoken quotation enter the talk, first of teachers of literature and then of their students? So I began to frame that, certainly theoretically, relative to the work of Bakhtin around dialogue and voices, and what he called heteroglot speech, the combination of different voices in single utterances. And I thought that was relevant as well, first because Bakhtin recognises that a literary text is in itself heteroglot, what he called a complex speech genre, representative of double voice discourse. But also I began to think that maybe in teaching that quoted text is, well, certainly it's mediated, but transformed as well. There's a sort of dual expression there, the expression of the novel, but also the voice of the speaker, whether it's a teacher or a student, enclosing the text in their talk. If I represent that graphically, you have on the left the text as double-voiced expression. On the right, how that text enters the teacher's talk, so it's embedded in the speech, represented in the speech bubble, and then an extra layer of complexity and interanimation of voices in the classroom, where in the centre you may have the teacher embedding the text, other speech bubbles representing students talking about the text, and then in the bottom right hand corner a speech bubble where a student themselves embeds the text as well through spoken quotation. And it was those relationships that I wanted to examine. And that led me, I suppose, in terms of methodology, to adapt conversation analysis. And again, this goes back to how I adapted the approach taken by Paul Seedhouse to apply to literature, was to explore what insights might be provided by representing the page, if you like, the study text as a speaker in the turn. First, to show how the teacher embedded the text structurally, just to mark that out very clearly, but also to explore how each instance of the page entering the speech related to the utterance, the broader utterance of the teacher around it. And you'll see here as well, I've used this symbol called the Silkrow or section sign to distinguish this from written quotation, because I feel it functions in different ways, and particularly pedagogically, which I'll illustrate in a moment. So in this extract, you have the teacher beginning the turn. He's scared, okay. He actually physically says, and then she adopts the voice of the text, and indeed the character. I'm afraid, and is really emphatic about the character saying I'm afraid. Then the teacher continues, okay, it's building up the fear and the tension, okay. And even there, it seemed to me that the emphasis enacted building up, it enacted suspense. And then again, the teacher breaks off to quote the text, I can bear it no more. And again, very emphatic, assuming the voice of the character. And then very briskly stepping out of that voice again into a teacher analytic voice, if you like. We don't know why Paul is scared. He deliberately evades the question when the lawyer Utterson says, now my good man, be explicit, what are you afraid of? And again, across all of that, as well as framing students' reading perspective, it of course also represents that narrative episode again, that exchange almost entirely, as well as abridged, I suppose, paraphrased, but the complete narrative event is represented very economically there as well. So in terms of theorizing that, I led to call that approach quotations in talk and exposition analysis, just to distinguish it from conversation analysis and recognize the focus on quoting text. And there you can see a sort of summary of what that's intended to achieve. In the last 2 or 3 bullet points, you can see the emphasis there on orientation, so how a speaker orients to the text, and then perhaps most importantly in terms of education research, how that might move us towards thinking about how the teacher positions students' readings, and often that will be relative to pedagogic goals, sometimes overtly expressed, maybe even in the lesson, possibly in a lesson plan, but sometimes more tacit, again, moment by moment aims on the part of teachers as well. But more broadly, I hope that method can represent novel as a distinctive form, but also that we need a way of describing that distinctive expert teaching around literature as well. And if I just move towards concluding about the implications of that, really, relative to positioning students' reading. So here you have the same extract that I read aloud previously, and I started to identify the different moves in those transcripts. So in the first highlighted item, it seemed to me the teacher was inviting students to, if you like, enter, or certainly the teacher was bringing the world of the novel, the diegetic world, into the classroom by performing it in that quotation, "I'm afraid." At the same time, in this newly highlighted, but the same item, the teacher is shaping an analytic perspective for students as well, simply in the act of selecting a quotation and marking it out for their attention. It's positioning it part of the text as an artifact for analytic attention within the flow of conversation. Thirdly, I mentioned the building up, the enactment, that positions students' reading may just be fleetingly and momentarily, but to recognise an aesthetic feature of the text. So multiple functions, pedagogic functions, even in half of a single turn. And finally, it seemed to me that the final comment by the teacher and further quotation had a sort of glossing effect, and again it's a sort of a weaving in the teacher's final embedded turn here of an explanation, if you like, or proposing a dilemma. We don't know why Poole is scared, and then interweaving this with a sort of the teacher's own interpretation of that event, and leaving it open for students to reflect on that as well. And again, that interpretation is supported in this instance by a quotation, which of course again may be a subtle way of modelling embedding quotation for students as well. Maybe it's a model for their writing, but it may also influence their talk. So those positioning functions seem to me an important dimension of literary study teaching, and I try to articulate them on this simple table, recognising the pedagogic function of each form of positioning, and at the bottom the different roles into which students are positioned according to that use of spoken quotation. So they may be an inhabitant momentarily in the world of the novel. They may be even concurrently asked to analyse the world of the novel. They may take that aesthete position and a broader critic perspective on the work of literature. So in summary, this is a sort of dialogic form of teacher exposition where the spoken quotation becomes an important resource for teaching. I think teachers use that in a very, in the terms of the conversation, a methodic, strategic way. It has perhaps a often tacit goal of supporting aesthetic reading, but it's also functioning to position students' reading as critics as well, and it's often very skillfully switched by teachers from one moment to the next, and very efficiently as well. And if I move now just towards some brief comment about how that's applied to university teacher education work, but return just to this slide for a second. You can see the bottom point there. I mentioned the skilled switching by experienced teachers. I used a transcript drawn from that same lesson about Jekyll and Hyde with student teachers that I worked with myself. And what interested me was when they saw the transcript, some of them suggested that maybe the teacher was talking for a little bit too long, and on the page of the transcript it looked like that teacher was speaking maybe for some considerable time, but in real time the teacher was speaking only for a minute or two, and so for me that was an interesting point of training as well. Was what are early or beginning teachers, what are their attitudes or assumptions about teacher talk or the function of teacher talk, and then a question for me was, well, how can transcripts help them reflect on teacher, well, not just teacher talk, of course, but how teachers guide interaction, and particularly how they do so around texts. And so in teacher development, I've started to use transcripts with these broad aims to actually recognise expert teaching through seeing transcripts, that may help them attend to nuances of language, not just in the transcript, but hopefully that they can transfer to classroom observations, that they do think carefully about the links between texts and talk, and that might give them some support when they plan lessons themselves, that they are thinking about exactly what it means to present the text, not just reading aloud for 10 minutes, but each interjection on their part is significant. And yeah, particularly to recognise what may otherwise be invisible, this very intuitive, apparently natural skill of the best teachers of literature. And in practice, just some final documents to share with you here, that's led to me devising an observation tool that after presentations of transcripts and some of the theoretical framework that I've shared today, resources that student teachers may use in their practicum or placement environments, where they observe experienced teachers and focus on how teachers frame the narrative. You can see that on this example here, or on this page, you can see the table related to positioning around the turn of the page that I've just shared as well. And so beginning teachers using that material in their early training, and some ongoing research for me is to explore their responses, what's helpful about this process, how it might be improved, how it relates, of course, to other aspects of teacher education, but particularly the relationship of transcripts to observation, and particularly because literary study is a discipline focused on often the word on the page. How do we help teachers of literature in the earliest stages of their training really think carefully about how they frame and guide conversation around those words on the page? And more broadly, in the book that Olje mentioned, I've developed a further terminology around that, different dimensions that are of course elaborated more fully in the book, and also relate to some of those aspects that I've just described as well. Another dimension is intertextuality. So I have also found data where, of course, the teacher is referring not just to a focal text, but many other texts as well, and how the teacher again helps students keep track of the quotation of all those texts, not just one, but how they keep track of several texts across a conversation. So by way of illustration, in a higher education literary study seminar, two speakers referred to, I think it was nearly 80 separate texts across just 2 minutes of conversation, which struck me as interesting about how people managed to understand and follow that conversation, and how those texts were brought into speech again. So the presentation ends. You have some details there of how to follow up some of these themes if you're interested, and of course beyond our discussion now as well, I'd really welcome comment and feedback. Be interested in your own teaching and research, and how that might relate to what I've described as well. And of course, I'm very interested to what extent these approaches might relate to your own research, work in teaching or teacher education, and how you might use these approaches yourself. So I look forward to your feedback and comments. Thank you very much.
So much, John. I can stop your screen
Thank you.
here. That's
Thanks.
fine. Thank you so much, John, for this inspiring talk. When we have many people on a Zoom webinar, of course, it's difficult to manage who will talk next, but I'm sure people want to ask questions. You can basically type your name on the chat box if you like, if you want to ask a question next or engage in the discussion. You can also use the emoticons there, but feel free to write everything. I think I and Elizabeth will be monitoring the chat, but please, whoever wants to go first for a question or a comment or in relation to the discussion questions that that John has put on his last slide, please unmute yourself, go ahead, and it would be better if you type your name first to the chat box so that we will know who will be speaking. And alternatively, of course, you can type your questions as well. Right. Some people have to leave, but to start with, I think what was really inspiring about your talk, among other things, was that the bringing together of different perspectives in research. To start with, Bakhtin's heteroglossia. You know, you had a modified version, an adapted version of conversation analysis, and adapted to the needs of this kind of data. And then that's something that that people who are doing research can learn from. But I'm sure there was something for anyone, for all of us in the group. There were teachers, student teachers, and emerging researchers as well. And okay, so there's a question from Vildan, and then I think Vildan's question is more related to poetry classes. Can we use these all these positions for those classes, she asks, and she has an answer there as well. But what is your take on this, John?
I would hope so, and actually, it's interesting that that you mentioned poetry. Thank you for that, because originally my research had focused on poetry actually, and students, not in this project, but students responding to poetry they hear. So actually, my first use of conversation analysis in literary study research had been to take out the text on the page and just explore how students were responding to poems they heard, and again the merits or demerits of that process, and again trying to understand perhaps the subtlety of their responses and also their achievements. So students that remembered and were able to quote fully lines from poems they heard, but of course not just the words, but also to echo the intonation of the poems they'd heard. So in an earlier study, we'd worked with a CD of around 25 different poems, and teachers just chose whatever they felt was appropriate to their class. But they were read by the poets themselves. So, for example, one striking example was a poem by Liz Lockhead, a Scottish poet, who read her own work with a Scottish accent, and of course and also very distinctive emphasis, which students echoed in their own quotation as well. So certainly a dimension I would be interested in returning to in this research, and I think the positioning dimension could apply. It's not something I've looked at directly yet with transcripts around poetry, but I'd certainly be interested if you find a way to follow that up and try that yourself. Yes, so I hope it could apply. Yeah.
Thanks, John. any other questions? I know that we have members from our faculty as well who are interested in more like the literature aspect of this, and also people who are involved in doing conversation analytic research. If there is no question for now, and then please keep thinking about further questions. I will ask a research related question. I wanted to keep the boring research part to the last, but just a question about the adaptation of seed houses contexts into a framework that worked for this data set and then for this analysis. So what was the most challenging thing when you transformed Paul Seedhouse's interactional contexts, institutional contexts into your new framework? What was the most difficult thing there when you analyze text plus talk together in a literature class, and then how did it work in terms of data analysis for you? If you have any reflections on that, that would help.
Yeah, I think it was. Well, it's a really interesting question, because on the slide where I showed the Seed House summary, first of all, his work I found very helpful and actually a sort of key really to moving forward with it. So because his work describes those three perspectives and what that institutional perspective means in terms of the discipline of second language study, because he does that so clearly, that was really helpful. But of course, in my slide I presented my version of it, but I would say the work sort of in between and arriving at that summary for literary study, that was probably the hardest part, about trying to pin down and recognize, try and identify what it was exactly that's distinctive about literary study. And I suppose that was the result of a backward and forward process of looking at the transcripts, doing some reading actually outside of the field of education research about the nature of quotation, for example, reflecting on the position of the text in talk. So it was all of those things in my mind, but the Seed House summary, it just occurred to me that if I could try and sort of echo that in some way, that would offer a concise way of summarizing. And I think obviously with the quotations as well, possibly thinking of and trying to justify the representation of the page as almost like a separate turn in conversation. And I think from coming from a background in teacher education, and actually previously as a teacher of English literature myself, I was aware of how much you do quote, moment by moment, and like the data suggested, 1 in every 3 turns. But I think it was a different thing to articulate that for an audience, a research audience, with a background in conversation analysis, but not necessarily so perhaps so engaged with the pedagogic dimension. So for me, it's important that the expression can inform teaching and research around teaching, in a way that's the main aim of the research, I hope. But of course that it's generated by the data. So I did find that a sort of very challenging sort of aspect. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your response. We have a question from Vicky, and then we will move on with Karin. So Vicky, feel free to turn on your mic and ask the question as well, but I'm gonna, if you don't, I will read it from here. Sorry, I cannot see Wiki now, but I will just read that for you. How do exam specifications and assessment requirements influence teacher talk when reading literary texts with exam classes?
That's a great question as well, because that was certainly one of the context of examination requirements around specifications for exams in the UK was an influence actually on why I felt it was important to start to look at quotation, because in the assessment criteria for students writing in examinations, their use of what the criteria refer to as textual references is really important, especially if students are going to access the highest grades. And again, it's common in UK teaching to spend a lot of time modelling writing that embeds quotations with students. And again, there are lots of well documented and promoted processes for doing that in the classroom. But again, it occurred to me that there's all that attention to those processes of modelling, and again through documents on the page, but there hasn't really been any attention to what actually happens in terms of how people talk about quotation in a classroom. And so at the very least, I suppose that the way people talk about quotations does have a tacit influence on how students understand them. So even a really simple thing that occurred to me in the transcripts was, if a teacher quotes, or indeed a student quotes a text, but doesn't actually say this is a quotation, you don't have any quotation marks in speech. So how do students in the class know, other than I could see Nina doing the sort of gesture of quotation? Unless someone does that, how do you know it's a quotation? And sometimes that's obvious, and again, the techniques that teachers use to, if you like, differentiate attentiveness, emphatically, but often they don't do that. So that intrigued me as well. So actually, the relationship with examinations was an interest for me, and a motivation as well. That certainly in terms of literary study teaching, that might be useful to understand a little bit further.
Karin, who is our colleague here at Mälardalen University, has a question. Karin, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, John. Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. And I was a bit, I felt jealous about teaching the student teachers that you teach, because you're teaching L1 students, right? Or L1 speakers. And I think that the situation in Sweden for L2 teachers is slightly different, because they're not all that, at least in my experience, the ones I teach, they're not all that comfortable, reading in English themselves, unfortunately. So that seems to be the first problem here. But I mean, I do see the need for reading in class, but I think, I may be wrong, but I think that many teachers sort of take the easy way out of letting students read to themselves at home, and then maybe discussing the text in class, but not actually reading to them, because that is challenging. So I just wonder if you have any ideas about that, or how we can help our teachers become more comfortable reading aloud.
Yes, I don't know that. I mean, I suppose in terms of well, thanks, Karin, for the question as well. I wonder. I mean, I've not taught second language learners myself, so I wouldn't claim any expertise on the specific pedagogy. But I wonder if there might be some. Actually, going back to the Seed House summary and then my own, that might be quite interesting. That somehow the place of texts in L2 literary study might have a different pedagogic frame. So maybe the interactions are distinctive as well. So I suppose you might apply. It might be possible to apply some of the methods I've used, but actually by attending to the transcripts, that might reveal some of the distinctive interactions and what's special about them and what's interesting about them. So I wouldn't know. Perhaps there'll be different pedagogic issues around quoting the text. So maybe again, I'm not an expert in this field, but perhaps if it's important to share text to support fluency of reading in the second language or pronunciation as well, or to introduce and extend vocabulary, that those are different pedagogic functions that could still be explored and analysed through the transcripts and commentaries around them.
I was thinking that when I've taught teachers of young learners, I always included reading aloud, because I feel, you know, for if any teachers are going to read aloud, that's, you know, the ones who are going to do it in English. I mean, for 7 or 8 year olds or something, and they generally feel less, I think, embarrassed about doing it as well, because their audience is younger.
Yes.
But I would really love to include that in you know, teaching for teachers who are going to teach upper secondary school as well. But it seems, oh, I don't know, there's so many things we need to do, and even though this you know would be sorely needed, I'm not sure we can fit it in. But it was really inspiring. I wish I could show your talk to my students. Maybe I can, actually, since it's recorded.
Yes, yeah. No, thank you, Karen. That's very kind, and yeah, I'd be really interested how it might apply to second language learning. And in fact, here at Norwich, I belong to a research group in our department that's focused on language in education, which includes colleagues who do specialise in second language learning as well. So yeah, I would hope I could learn from colleagues in the department, and indeed yourself if you work on this as well. Yeah, I'd be really interested.
My own research is more sort of literary, but I think that this would be it would be worth doing, finding out how, you know, how it could work in a Swedish context as well. So.
Okay. Thanks, Karen. Thank you.
Maybe just since there is no question coming
Oh,
after that,
actually, Olcay, sorry, but we have a question from Nina, which actually
course.
relates to what Karin just said, and then there's a previous question that we missed from Vildan. So maybe Nina, we should take your question first. And before I even read that, I just wanted to say that the audience wanted to know whether you would share their presentation as well, John. So the PowerPoint.
Sure, yep. Yep, of course, that's fine. Yeah, be very happy to.
So I don't know, Nina, do you want to speak, or should I just read your question?
You can read it if you want to.
All right. Well, so sometimes I hear from other teachers that they think reading in class takes a lot of time from other things. I love reading and got a lot of arguments from your presentation to keep reading and to keep doing my spoken quotation. But if you were to give me your best arguments for not giving the students reading a book as homework, what would that be? I would love that. Sorry, that was I misread it.
I mean, I think that's a great question as well. I think it's the work of the teachers represented in the transcripts that provides the answer to that. In that, where the individual teachers are, if you like, embodying and enlivening the narratives in ways that students, you know, in those broader interviews, students sort of recognised. You know, if they were studying for their exams, they recognised they wouldn't respond in the same way if they or get the same depth of understanding if they were reading alone privately, and also people that commented in the public survey who you know, it may have been 40 or 50 years for some of them since they read at school, and yet they remembered those experiences of reading together, and like the slide of the gentleman who said he felt like a starving man at a banquet. If you can have that impact, I think it says a lot about the purpose of education beyond doing well in exams, but about, you know, enjoyment and interest in reading that can sustain many people and help, you know, I suppose we all learn in many different ways from reading fiction, and can do you know, have a lot of enjoyment doing so across our lives as well. So for me, that seems like quite a compelling argument from the voices of people who were involved in those studies as well.
Thank you.
So Vilda's question is about your research framework, rather, or if you've evaluated which positioning the teacher adopts more commonly in your study. I mean, is there a difference in whether they take the analytical or aesthetic positioning, for example?
No, I haven't got that far in terms of, if you like, quantifying the ratio of those different moves. It would interest me to do so, because I would anticipate that might differ a little bit according to teaching styles, and again in the UK at least, I would anticipate that might differ according to the phase in education as well, or the year group in a secondary school. That there might be, and again, actually, if you take the Louise Rosenblatt phrase of embryonic critics, that again there might be, and again it will perhaps vary from one department in a school to another, but there might be different ways in which that there is a deliberate progression in that development of literary criticism among the students, which I would anticipate would affect the patterns of discourse as well. But maybe related to that question, I think one focus I've had in the higher education data was I referred to intertextuality and using many different texts. So I was interested there in how actually the act of quoting and sometimes repeating the quotes became an anchor in the progress of the conversation. So and at what points teachers chose to come back to single quotes. So again, in some of that transcript data, a teacher who was actually very economical, and this again leads me to anticipate that it might vary across phases or according to teaching styles. So yeah, a teacher who probably said no more than 20 words in an exchange. I think when that teacher quoted, it was maybe a 2-word quotation, but that quotation was repeated and seemed to be an important anchor for managing the conversation, maintaining concentration and actually of the participants, and also prompting the other student speaker to keep a focus on, not because it was overtly necessary, but just to maintain that interest in the interaction on a specific part of the text. So I'm not sure that answers Phil Dunn's question directly, but that's the dimension that I've moved into more recently. But yes, certainly that ratio could be interesting to possibly inform thinking about progression in literary study as well, and what that looks like in terms of pedagogy as well as curricular design.
Olcay, you're on mute.
Sorry, I still do that when I have the 2 screens. Sorry for that. Well, we have our teachers from Sweden here who also commented on Karin's comment basically, and said they read aloud, and then I want to comment on that as well. And going back to the Swedish context, I think what you did and what you presented us can still apply to a great extent, because I think we are in a privileged position too. We live in a country where we are basically second in world ranking when it comes to English as a foreign language proficiency. So we have also, of course, in addition to the problems that Karin mentioned, many student teachers who are really competent, and then also I have observed myself many teachers here delivering literature classes, and literature is an important component of upper secondary school curriculum, especially when it comes to English 6 and English 7. I can feel that some of the things that you have shown us today can be applied. And there's one key word that you used, enjoyment. I think it was you, if I remember it right. It's extremely important, and also enjoyment as a construct, as a psychological construct, has recently been shown to be very effective, an important factor in second language acquisition. This is research that has flourished in the last couple of years within the framework of positive psychology, and then how actually literature can be a catalyst. So if there's anyone who wants to read more about enjoyment, I'll be happy to share. Just feel free to send me an email. Okay, Elizabeth, do you want to? She's much better in this compared to me. Sorry.
I don't know, but we'll help each other out. There's a long comment from Sylvia.
Yes.
Sylvia, maybe you want to talk about your comment? I won't be able to do it justice.
Hi. No, just in relation to what Karin was mentioning before, I basically was involved at some point in teacher education courses for young learners here in Sweden. And basically, and I was just subbing, so the idea was not mine. I cannot take credit for that. But what they were doing basically was that the teacher candidates, they had to prepare a lesson plan based on a storybook of their choice. A storybook that of course would be sort of appropriate for the age of their future students. And associated with the teaching module, there was a pronunciation module. And basically, one of the assignments in the pronunciation module, one of the final assignments, consisted of reading aloud parts of the selected sort of storybook. And so, I mean, so this idea of reading in a certain way and reading for the student enjoyment and reading also to, in a way that's a sort of young learners, young EFL learners we're talking about here. So reading in a way that sort of can help the students follow the characters better, the plot better, and can create interest for the students. So that was the idea. So I guess it can be done. There are ways to do it. I thought that this was a creative assignment, meaning, you know, creatively thought out assignment, something like that, which worked well for the students.
Yeah, sorry, can I comment on that? We do something similar at MDH as well with young learners. And I, you know, specifically teach them to read aloud for that, and to do things with books. I mean, that's a big part of especially after 3 teacher training in English. But I was thinking about the problems with the subject teachers, with the older, you know, the teachers of those who are going to teach older students, high school students. Because there it becomes much more about, I don't know, I think it's more difficult to get literature into their training. We teach them literature, of course, but it's, I don't know, literature, reading, this kind of, the kind of sort of interactive commenting, quoting and so on. I mean, that's what I do with my students here at university. I think it would be really difficult to expect teachers to do that with high school students. That's sort of what I was aiming for. But maybe I'm wrong. I've had comments here, you know, people saying that they do this sort of thing with their students in school. So if that's true, I'm really happy. I was thinking that maybe it would be too advanced for them. So, but great if it happens.
Those comments, Karin, and following Sylvia's question actually just remind me of another way in which the transcripts have been used in teacher education sessions, and one approach I've used is using some of the material you saw, for example, the items from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where I read the conversation analysis version. That what I have done is provide those, and also provided the details of the Jefferson annotation, and just explain those to student teachers, and just ask them to rehearse reading some of the transcripts aloud, certainly before I've read them to them or they've heard any recordings, and just to have a go at reading aloud and from the transcripts, and trying to mirror the intonations that the experienced teachers used. And what that did was, initially, of course, they find that very strange, and it has quite a distancing effect, unsurprisingly. But actually, once they get into that a little bit, I think it does reveal to them. It can seem quite mannered to start with. Obviously we sort of set it up. And they quite often laugh awkwardly as they do that as well. It's quite enjoyable to work from the transcripts, but the serious point from doing that and working through that is that, yes, they realise that a teacher's exposition, especially around quoting, it may be quite mannered and it may seem a little bit different from the flow of everyday speech, but they then I hope it draws their attention to that very emphatic use of quotation and the quick switching that's demonstrated in that transcript of the experienced teacher. And hopefully, so my sense more anecdotally and informally from my work as a teacher educator was that many student teachers do arrive at that almost inevitably through practice and repetition during their training, but it seems to me part of the role of my role as a teacher educator was, if there's a way to help people arrive at any skill more quickly and more effectively, then I should build that into forms of teacher education. And so I hope that the transcripts might contribute to that, and to an area where again, I'd not really been aware of many resources that would enable that, and yet, as the data showed, if a teacher was using quotation in a third of all their turns, it would seem to be a really important skill. Otherwise, you're missing a third of the opportunities to influence your students' response to the text as effectively as you might perhaps as well. So. Yeah.
That's brilliant. I really like the idea of using your transcripts in that way, sort of patterning or modeling, and using a pattern for how you can do that yourself as a teacher. That's brilliant. Very good idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I know that we want to keep discussing, but we are already 5 minutes over, and I hope we can have you here in Västerås, John, one day. We talked about this. So this talk could be actually with John being here in Västerås with us, but then, as you all know, it was not quite possible. But thank you so much. You brought together people from 15 different countries for your talk today, to start with people from South America, Europe, different parts of the world. I will send more details on that later. This was very relevant for us, for our Swedish context too. And I think the diversity of both research and teaching perspectives were quite inspiring. We all got something with us today, I think. Thank you so much. I want to thank you on behalf of our research environment here and then our university, and of course for all the participants. I guess I will receive your PowerPoint
yes,
document, and I will then send it to people interested. We will also make your talk available as soon as we can. That might take some time, but I know that there have been that I have received many messages from people who asked for it. So thank you very much for being so generous with your time and then with your work. I'm hoping that we will see you again.
Thank you. It's been great to meet everyone, and thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Olcay, for inviting me as well. Thank you.
And thank you all for great questions and then for your participation as well. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.